February 20th, 1944. 22,000 feet above Brunswick, Germany. The contrails stretched across the sky like chalk lines on a slate-grey board, each white streak marking another formation of B-17 flying fortresses pushing deeper into the Rye. Inside the cockpit of Charlotte's Web, Captain James Donovan pushed his P-51B Mustang hard, the Packard-built Merlin engine howling as he struggled to keep pace with the bombers his squadron was supposed to protect. His fuel gauge told a story he'd seen too many times before, a story that always ended the same way. "Red Leader, this is Red 3. The voice crackled through his headset, tight with frustration. "I'm at bingo fuel. We gotta turn back." Donovan's jaw clenched as he scanned his own instruments. The needle hovered just above the minimum fuel reserve needed to make it back to RAF Debden in England. They were still 60 miles from the target A ball bearing factory in Schweinfurt that 8th Air Force intelligence had designated as critical to the Nazi war machine. Below them, 300 B-17s continued their steady march eastward, their bellies heavy with bombs, their crews depending on the fighters above to keep the Luftwaffe at bay. "Copy that, Red 3. Donovan's response tasted like defeat. "All Red Squadron, we're RTB. Good luck down there, big friends." The acknowledgement from the bomber formation commander was professional, emotionless. "Roger, little friends. We'll see you next time." But both men knew what next time meant. It meant counting the empty hardstands when the bombers returned. It meant writing letters to mothers and wives. It meant watching formation after formation take off at dawn, each one smaller than the last, until there weren't enough crews left to fill the sky. As Donovan banked his Mustang westward, he watched the bomber stream continue east, now naked against the German fighters he knew were assembling somewhere beyond the horizon. The P-51 was supposed to be the answer, the long-range escort fighter that would finally allow American bombers to strike deep into Germany with impunity. It had the speed. It had the maneuverability. It had everything except the one thing that mattered most: range. The Merlin engine beneath his cowling was a masterpiece of British engineering, producing 1,490 horsepower at war emergency power. The P-51B could cruise at 350 miles per hour and dogfight with anything the Luftwaffe put in the air. But at operational altitudes, burning high-octane aviation fuel at combat rates, even with 275-gallon drop tanks, the Mustang could only escort bombers about 475 miles from base. Berlin was 600 miles away. Schweinfurt was 480. Even today's target at Brunswick was pushing it. The mathematics were brutal and inflexible. The 8th Air Force had bet everything on daylight precision bombing, the doctrine that American bombers, flying in tight defensive formations, could fight their way to any target in Europe and destroy it with unprecedented accuracy. But the doctrine had a fatal flaw. It assumed the bombers could protect themselves. The October 1943 raid on Schweinfurt had proven otherwise. Of 291 bombers that struck the target, 60 were shot down and 138 were damaged. 600 men killed or captured in a single day. The press called it Black Thursday. After Black Thursday, the truth became undeniable: unescorted bombers over Germany were simply targets in a shooting gallery. The Luftwaffe had been fighting over their own territory for 4 years. They knew every trick, every defensive tactic, every weapon that could bring down a B-17. The German fighters would wait, circling just beyond the range of the American escorts, watching the P-47 Thunderbolts turn back when their fuel ran low. Then they would attack. You've probably seen the combat footage, the grainy black and white films showing B-17s exploding in mid-air, their wings folding like paper, bodies tumbling through space, parachutes blossoming white against the dark earth below. Each one of those images represented 10 men, 10 families destroyed, 10 empty chairs at American dinner tables. The bombers kept flying, kept dying, because there was no other way to carry the war to Germany. But everyone knew the current situation was unsustainable. Donovan brought his Mustang down through the cloud layer over the English Channel, the grey water below matching the grey sky above. His wingman, Second Lieutenant Tommy Walsh, pulled up alongside, his aircraft's invasion stripes clearly visible in the damp afternoon light. Walsh was 22 years old, fresh out of training, with exactly 11 combat missions under his belt. He'd arrived at Debden full of confidence, eager to get into the fight. That confidence had eroded with each mission. Each time they'd been forced to turn back while the bombers continued east, Each time they'd returned to base and waited to see how many wouldn't come back. The radio had been silent during their return flight, but as they crossed the English coast, it exploded with chatter, the returning bomber formations calling their bases, announcing their positions, requesting emergency landing clearances. Donovan could hear it in their voices, the exhaustion, the damage reports, the casualties. Blue Jay Control. This is Hammer 3-5. We have wounded aboard. Request priority landing. Over. Hammer 3-5. Roger. You're cleared straight in to runway 27. Meet wagons standing by. Control. This is Fortress Baker 2-2. We've lost 2 engines and our hydraulics are shot. We're not going to make it to base. Request vector to nearest emergency field. The litany continued as Donovan guided his P-51 toward Debden. He'd been flying combat missions since June of 1943, 8 months that felt like 8 years. He'd seen good pilots die. He'd seen lucky pilots die. He'd seen careful pilots and reckless pilots die. The common thread was always the same: they ran out of fuel before they ran out of enemies. RAF Debden materialized below them, a grid of runways and taxiways carved into the Essex countryside, surrounded by dispersal areas where over 70 fighters sat in their revetments. Donovan dropped his landing gear and flaps, feeling the Mustang's clean lines turn draggy and reluctant as he bled off speed. The wheels touched down on the wet concrete with a chirp of rubber, and he taxied toward his hardstand, where his crew chief would be waiting. Staff Sergeant Eddie Nowak stood beside the revetment, his coveralls stained with oil and hydraulic fluid, his face weathered beyond his 26 years. He'd been maintaining fighters since before the war, first P-40s in the Philippines, then P-47s in England, and now P-51s. He knew every bolt, every fitting, every specification in the technical manual. He also knew that those specifications were killing his pilots. As Donovan cut the engine and the Merlin's distinctive roar wound down to silence, he popped the canopy and pulled off his oxygen mask, sucking in the cold English air. The sweet smell of high-octane aviation fuel mixed with the acrid tang of burnt oil and hot metal. "How'd she run, Captain?" Nowak called up, already climbing onto the wing to help Donovan out of the cramped cockpit. "Like a dream, Eddie. Right up until we had to turn back and leave 300 bombers to fend for themselves." Nowak's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes: anger, frustration, determination. Donovan couldn't tell which. The crew chief had seen it too, mission after mission. The best fighter in the world, hamstrung by fuel capacity. "Same story, different day," Nowak muttered, pulling the Form 1 from his pocket to record any maintenance issues. "Any squawks?" "Negative. She's perfect. She's just not perfect enough." As Donovan climbed down from the wing, his legs stiff from 3 hours in the cramped cockpit, he could see the bomber formations beginning their return, dark specks against the grey clouds. He started counting the gaps in the formations, the empty spaces where fortresses had been that morning. It was a habit he hated but couldn't break. The debriefing was held in a Quonset hut that smelled of wet wool and cigarette smoke. 40 pilots crammed into folding chairs, their flight suits still damp with sweat despite the February cold, while intelligence officers recorded their observations. The bombers had been hit hard. 21 B-17s lost, 210 men gone. The Luftwaffe had waited until the escorts turned back, then swarmed the formations with everything they had: Bf-109s, FW-190s, even twin-engine Me-110s firing rockets from beyond defensive gun range. "We're getting our asses handed to us," Major Frank Harrison, the squadron operations officer, said after the intel officers left. He didn't bother with the usual command rhetoric about how they were winning, how the mission was a success, how the sacrifice was worth it. The pilots in this room had been flying long enough to know better. "Until we can stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back, this is going to keep happening." "What about modifications?" someone asked. "Can we add more fuel tanks?" "Engineering is working on it. Maybe by summer we'll have a solution." Maybe. Maybe by summer. How many more Black Thursdays between now and then? How many more empty chairs in the mess hall? As the pilots filed out into the fading afternoon light, Donovan noticed Eddie Nowak standing near the maintenance shack, talking intently with several other crew chiefs. They were huddled around something technical manuals spread across an oil drum, pointing at specifications, arguing in the shorthand language of mechanics who'd spent years making broken things work and working things perform beyond their limits. Nowak glanced up and caught Donovan's eye. For a moment, the crew chief looked like he wanted to say something, but then he just nodded and turned back to the other mechanics. Later, Donovan would remember that moment, the intensity in Nowak's face, the way his finger had been stabbing at something in the technical manual, the way the other mechanics had been listening like disciples receiving revelation. That night, in the officers' quarters, Donovan lay awake listening to the rain drum against the Quonset hut's metal roof. Tomorrow there would be another mission. Tomorrow he would escort bombers as far as his fuel would allow, then turn back and hope they survived without him. Tomorrow would be exactly like today, like yesterday, like every day since the 8th Air Force had committed itself to the daylight bombing campaign. Except tomorrow would be different. Because at that moment, 200 yards away in the maintenance hangar, Eddie Nowak was sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor with the Allison V1710 engine manual in one hand and the Packard V1650 Merlin manual in the other, comparing boost pressure specifications, fuel consumption rates, and detonation margins. He'd been thinking about a problem, the kind of problem that kept crew chiefs awake at night, that gnawed at them while they worked, that made them question every assumption they'd been taught. The P-51B Merlin engine was rated for a maximum boost pressure of 67 inches of mercury at war emergency power. That was the factory specification, the limit printed in bold type and underlined in red in the technical manual. Exceeding that pressure risked detonation, uncontrolled combustion that could destroy pistons, punch holes through cylinder heads, seize crankshafts, and turn a $50,000 fighter into a flaming coffin at 25,000 feet. But Nowak had been running engines for almost a decade. He understood that factory specifications included safety margins. He knew that British specifications were often more conservative than American ones. And he'd been doing math dangerous, unauthorized math that violated every regulation in the book. Higher boost pressure meant more air forced into the combustion chambers. More air meant more fuel could be burned. More fuel meant more power. But here was the critical insight. If you adjusted the mixture properly, if you ran the engine slightly lean at cruise settings, that extra power could be converted into efficiency. The engine wouldn't work harder. It would work smarter. And that meant range. The technical manual said it couldn't be done. The factory said it would destroy the engine. Every engineer at Packard Motors would have told him he was crazy. But Eddie Nowak had never trusted engineers as much as he trusted his own hands, his own eyes, his own experience maintaining engines that officially should have failed but somehow kept running. Tomorrow, when Captain Donovan climbed into Charlotte's Web for the next mission, he wouldn't know that his crew chief had spent the entire night making unauthorized adjustments to his engine. He wouldn't know that the boost pressure tolerances had been carefully, methodically exceeded. He wouldn't know that Eddie Nowak had committed what technically qualified as sabotage under military regulations. But he would notice something different. And that difference would change everything. February 21st, 1944. 5:30 hours. RAF Debden. The pre-dawn darkness smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke, and aviation fuel. Captain James Donovan stood in the operations room with 32 other pilots, studying the red line on the map that stretched from England deep into Germany. Today's target, a synthetic oil plant at Gotha, 520 miles from base. The groans were audible when the intelligence officer pulled back the curtain to reveal the route. "Gentlemen, I know what you're thinking," Colonel Hubert Zemke, the group commander, said from the front of the room. "You're thinking we can't make it to Gotha and back. You're right. But we're going to escort the big friends as far as we can, and pray that the Luftwaffe sleeps in." Nobody laughed. The Luftwaffe never slept in. Donovan walked to his P-51 in the pre-dawn gloom, his breath misting in the cold February air. The hard stand was illuminated by a single work light, and he could see Eddie Nowak making final checks on the aircraft. The crew chief looked like he hadn't slept. His eyes were red-rimmed, his movements had the jerky precision of someone running on coffee and nervous energy. "She's ready for you, Captain," Nowak said, but there was something odd in his voice. Not the usual confidence, but something tighter, more anxious. "You okay, Eddie? You look like hell." "Long night." Nowak paused, then seemed to make a decision. "Captain, I need you to do something for me today. I need you to watch your fuel consumption carefully. Real carefully. And I need you to note any difference in engine performance temperature, manifold pressure, anything unusual." Donovan studied his crew chief's face in the dim light. "What did you do to my airplane, Eddie?" "Nothing that's going to hurt you. Trust me on that. Just pay attention to your gauges, okay?" There wasn't time for more questions. The sky was lightening to the east, and across the airfield, Merlin engines were coughing to life, their distinctive roar building as 56 P-51s prepared for takeoff. Donovan climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and ran through his pre-flight checks by rote, his mind still puzzling over Nowak's cryptic instructions. The engine start was normal. The Merlin caught on the first try and settled into its characteristic rumble. Manifold pressure read normal. Oil pressure normal. Coolant temperature rising steadily. Everything by the book. Donovan taxied into position, received clearance from the tower, and pushed the throttle forward. And that's when he felt it. The acceleration was wrong. Not bad, wrong, good, wrong. Charlotte's Web surged forward with more authority than usual. The tail came up quicker, and the wheels left the runway with 50 yards of concrete to spare. Donovan glanced at his manifold pressure gauge, confirming he was at normal takeoff power, then looked at his airspeed indicator. They were climbing faster than usual, gaining altitude at a rate that shouldn't be possible at this power setting. "Red 2, you seeing what I'm seeing?" That was Lieutenant Walsh on his wing, sounding confused. "Depends what you're seeing, Tommy." "My bird's climbing like she's got a rocket strapped to her ass." Donovan keyed his radio to the ground frequency. "Debden Tower, Red Leader. Are the rest of my birds performing normally?" There was a pause, then, "Red Leader, affirmative. All aircraft report normal engine parameters." "Why do you ask?" "No reason. Red Leader out." But it wasn't normal. As they climbed through 10,000 feet and formed up with the bomber stream, Donovan kept watching his gauges. The manifold pressure was reading slightly higher than usual at cruise power, not enough to be alarming, but definitely higher. Yet the engine temperature was fine, the oil pressure was steady, and the fuel consumption. He did the math twice, checking his fuel flow against his ground speed, his altitude, his power setting. The numbers didn't make sense. According to his calculations, he was getting approximately 15% better fuel efficiency than the manual said he should. 15%. That would translate to roughly 70 extra miles of range. Maybe more. The bomber stream pushed east through scattered clouds, 300 B-17s in tight combat boxes, their contrails painting white lines across the morning sky. The P-51s wove above and around them in a loose defensive pattern, scanning the sky for the Luftwaffe fighters they knew would come. The Channel fell away below, replaced by the patchwork fields of occupied France, then the industrial sprawl of the Ruhr Valley. At 350 miles from base, right on schedule, the P-47 Thunderbolts that had escorted the bombers from the coast turned back, their fuel exhausted. The Mustangs moved in closer, knowing they were now the only thing standing between the bombers and the German fighters. At 400 miles, Donovan checked his fuel. According to the manual, he should be getting nervous right now, calculating whether he had enough fuel to turn back. But his gauges told a different story. He had plenty of fuel, not just enough to turn back, but enough to continue escorting. He keyed his radio to the squadron frequency. "All red aircraft, this is Red Leader. Sound off with fuel state." One by one, his pilots reported. Every single one had more fuel remaining than they should. Not a little, more significantly more. The entire squadron was experiencing the same impossible efficiency. "Red Leader, this is Red 3. Lieutenant Walsh sounded excited. "I'm showing fuel for another hour of flight time. Maybe more. What the hell is going on?" Donovan had a pretty good idea what was going on, and it involved a certain crew chief who hadn't slept last night. But that was a conversation for later. Right now, he had a decision to make, a decision that violated every operational order he'd been given. "All red aircraft, we're staying with the bombers. Continue escort to target." The bomber formation commander came on the radio immediately. "Red Leader, confirm your last transmission. You're staying with us." "Affirmative. Big friend. We've got fuel to spare." There was a long pause, then, "Red Leader, I don't know what kind of miracle you boys pulled off, but my crew thanks you. We all thank you. At 475 miles, where the P-51s normally turned back, Donovan watched the fuel gauge and made another calculation. They could make it to the target. They could actually make it all the way to Gotha and back. For the first time since the bombing campaign began, American bombers wouldn't have to face the Luftwaffe alone over Germany. The German fighters appeared at 10:15 hours, a swarm of Bf-109s diving out of the sun, aiming for the lead bomber formation. But this time, the P-51s were there to meet them. Donovan rolled Charlotte's Web inverted and dove, Walsh tucked in tight on his wing, 2 more Mustangs following in perfect formation. The engagement lasted 7 minutes of violent maneuvering, guns hammering, aircraft twisting through 3-dimensional space at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. When it was over, 3 German fighters were falling earthward trailing smoke, and the bomber formation was intact. The Luftwaffe tried twice more before the bombers reached Gotha, but each time the Mustangs were there, and each time the Germans broke off without pressing their attack. They'd grown used to arriving after the escorts left. The presence of P-51s this deep into Germany was something new, something unexpected, something that changed the tactical equation completely. You need to understand what this meant. For months, the Luftwaffe had been winning the battle over Germany through simple arithmetic. They could afford to trade fighters for bombers because fighters took weeks to build while bombers took months. They could replace pilots faster than America could train new bomber crews. The mathematics of attrition favored the defender. But if American fighters could escort the bombers all the way to the target and back, that arithmetic collapsed. Now the Luftwaffe would have to fight through the escorts first, and P-51s were more than a match for anything Germany had in the air. The bombing run over Gotha was textbook perfect clear skies, accurate bombing, heavy damage to the synthetic oil plant. And when the bombers turned for home, the P-51s were still there, still had fuel, still had ammunition. The Germans tried one more attack as the formation crossed back into occupied France, but by then the Mustang pilots' blood was up. They'd escorted bombers to a target 520 miles from base, something that wasn't supposed to be possible, and they were in no mood to let the Luftwaffe spoil their achievement. Donovan's flight splashed 2 more Bf-109s over the French countryside, and then they were over the Channel, the white cliffs of Dover rising from the grey water, and home. Charlotte's Web touched down at RAF Debden with 30 minutes of fuel remaining. 30 minutes. Donovan taxied to his hardstand in a daze, his mind still processing what had just happened. They'd flown a mission that, according to every specification, every manual, every operational order, should have been impossible. And they'd done it because a crew chief had decided that the rules were wrong. Eddie Nowak was waiting at the hardstand, and the expression on his face was complex pride mixed with anxiety, satisfaction mixed with fear. He'd committed an act that could get him court-martialed. He'd modified military aircraft without authorization, exceeded factory specifications, and endangered the life of his pilot. He'd also potentially changed the entire course of the air war over Europe. Donovan cut the engine and sat in the sudden silence, watching the propeller coast to a stop. Then he popped the canopy and climbed out onto the wing, his legs shaking from adrenaline and 3 hours of high-G maneuvering. "Captain." Nowak's voice was tight. "How'd she run?" Donovan jumped down from the wing and faced his crew chief. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied the man who'd taken an enormous risk on his behalf. Then he broke into a grin. "Eddie, what the hell did you do to my engine?" I increased the boost pressure. Just a little. 7 inches above spec. And I leaned out the fuel mixture at cruise settings." The words came out in a rush, defensive, apologetic. "I know I should have asked permission, but I knew you'd say no, and I had to try something. These bombers are getting slaughtered because we can't stay with them, and I thought maybe Eddie." Donovan gripped the crew chief's shoulder. "We made it to Gotha and back. We escorted the bombers all the way to the target. The entire squadron. Do you understand what that means?" Nowak's eyes widened. "The whole squadron? I only modified your Bird and Tommies." "Well, apparently whatever magic you worked, we all got it. Check with the other crew chiefs. I guarantee they're seeing the same thing." Within an hour, the maintenance hangar was in an uproar. Every crew chief who'd serviced a P-51 that morning was reporting the same anomaly: increased performance, better fuel economy, extended range. And every crew chief was denying making any modifications. Except Eddie Nowak. He stood in the center of the hangar, surrounded by mechanics, explaining what he'd done. The boost pressure increase. The fuel mixture adjustment. The theoretical calculations that said it should work. The practical test that morning that proved it did work. You're saying you hot-rodded a P-51? Master Sergeant Bill Crawford, the maintenance chief, looked like he couldn't decide whether to recommend Nowak for a medal or a court-martial. You exceeded the factory specs on a combat aircraft without authorization. I calculated the safety margins, Sergeant. The Merlin can handle it. The Brits have been running their Spitfires at higher boost for over a year. We're just playing it too safe. Playing it safe keeps engines from exploding, Nowak. And playing it safe is getting bomber crews killed. There was heat in Nowak's voice now, frustration that had been building for months. We've got the best escort fighter in the world, and we can't use it because we're too scared to push the engines past their comfort zone. Well, I pushed it. And it worked. Captain Donovan escorted bombers 520 miles into Germany and brought them home. When's the last time that happened? The hangar went silent. Every man there had watched bomber after bomber take off and not come back. Every man there had friends in those bomber crews. Every man there had been looking for a solution, any solution, to the mathematics of death that governed the daylight bombing campaign. Crawford looked at the other mechanics, saw the same calculation happening in every face. Then he turned back to Nowak. Show me exactly what you did. Every adjustment, every setting, every measurement. And then we're going to test it properly. For the next 3 hours, the maintenance crews tore down a Merlin engine and examined it piece by piece, looking for any sign of damage from the higher boost pressure. They found nothing. The pistons were fine. The cylinder heads were clean. The crankshaft showed normal wear. The engine had been pushed 7 inches of manifold pressure beyond its rated maximum, and it hadn't even noticed. By evening, word had reached Colonel Zemke. He arrived at the hangar still wearing his flight suit, having just returned from a meeting at 8th Air Force headquarters. He listened to Nowak's explanation with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Sergeant Nowak, do you understand that what you've done is technically sabotage? That I could have you arrested right now? Yes, sir. Do you understand that if that engine had failed and Captain Donovan had been killed, you would be facing a murder charge? Yes, sir. Zemke studied the crew chief for a long moment, then turned to Crawford. Can we do this modification to the entire group? All our aircraft? Sir, we'd need authorization from 8th Air Force Engineering. This exceeds factory specifications. We'd be voiding warranties, violating maintenance protocols. I didn't ask about protocols, Sergeant. I asked if we can do it. Crawford glanced at Nowak, then back at Zemke. Yes, sir. We can do it tonight. Have every bird modified by morning. Then do it. I'll handle the paperwork and the fallout. Zemke looked around the hangar at the assembled mechanics. Gentlemen, as of this moment, this modification is classified. Nobody talks about this outside this hangar. Nobody writes home about it. Nobody mentions it in the mess hall. If word gets back to headquarters before I can brief them properly, this program gets shut down before it starts. Understood. A chorus of yes, sir echoed through the hangar. Zemke turned to leave, then paused. Sergeant Nowak? That was either the stupidest thing you've ever done, or the smartest. We'll find out which tomorrow. But if this works the way you think it will, you might have just saved this bombing campaign. That night, while the pilots slept, mechanics swarmed over every P-51 at RAF Debden. They adjusted boost pressures, recalibrated fuel mixtures, made careful notes of every change. By dawn, 60 fighters had been modified according to Eddie Nowak's unauthorized specifications. By dawn, the 8th Air Force had unknowingly acquired the capability to escort bombers anywhere in Germany. And by dawn, Eddie Nowak was sitting on an oil drum outside the maintenance hangar, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands, realizing that he'd just committed his life and his career to a theory that would either revolutionize the air war or get him court-martialed. The February sun broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Across the field, engines began starting for the morning mission, another deep penetration raid, another test of the modifications, another roll of the dice. Nowak crushed out his cigarette and walked back into the hangar. There was work to do. February 22, 1944. 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. Brigadier General Frederick Castle was not a man easily surprised. He'd commanded bomber formations over Germany, survived fighter attacks that killed half his group, and made decisions that sent thousands of men into combat. But the report sitting on his desk at 8 o'clock hours that Tuesday morning managed to catch him completely off guard. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. Castle looked up at his operations officer, Colonel Ted Milton. Yesterday, the 4th Fighter Group escorted bombers 520 miles to Gotha and back. They didn't turn back at the normal fuel limit. They stayed with the formation all the way to target and home. And according to this report, they did it because a sergeant modified their engines without authorization. That's correct, sir. A crew chief named Nowak increased the boost pressure beyond factory specifications and adjusted the fuel mixture. Colonel Zemke is claiming the modification increased range by at least 75 miles, maybe more. Castle read through the report again, looking for the catch. There had to be a catch. The range limitation of escort fighters wasn't a problem that could be solved by a mechanic tinkering in a hangar. It was a fundamental engineering constraint that Packard Motors, North American Aviation, and every expert in the Army Air Forces had been trying to solve for months. The idea that some sergeant had cracked it overnight was absurd. What about engine reliability? Structural integrity? Are we looking at increased failure rates? Zemke says they've run diagnostic tests. No unusual wear, no damage. The engines are handling it fine. And this modification has been applied to his entire group? Without authorization from engineering? Yes, sir. As of this morning, all P-51s in the 4th Fighter Group are running the modified specifications. Castle leaned back in his chair and lit a cigarette, thinking through the implications. If the modification actually worked, if it really did increase range without sacrificing reliability, it would change everything. The 8th Air Force could strike Berlin. They could hit targets deep in Poland, Czechoslovakia, anywhere in the Reich. The Luftwaffe would have nowhere to hide. But if it didn't work, if those modified engines started failing in combat, dozens of pilots would die and the blood would be on Castle's hands for not shutting it down immediately. Get me North American Aviation on the phone. And Packard Motors. I want their engineers to look at this modification and tell me if it's going to kill our pilots. Castle stubbed out his cigarette. And tell Zemke to stand by for a call from me. If this doesn't work, he's going to need a damn good lawyer. But before Castle could make that call, the phone on his desk rang. It was Major General William Kepner, commander of 8 Fighter Command, and he was calling from his headquarters at Bushy Hall. Fred, are you seeing what I'm seeing? I've got reports coming in from 3 different fighter groups claiming they found a way to extend the range of the P-51. They're all describing the same modification: boost pressure increase, fuel mixture adjustment. What the hell is going on? Castle felt his stomach drop. 3 groups? I thought this was just the 4th. The 4th flew the first mission yesterday, but apparently word got around. Last night, crew chiefs from the 352nd and 357th fighter groups heard about it and started making the same modifications to their aircraft. We've got over 200 fighters running unauthorized engine specs right now, and the number's growing. This was worse than Castle had thought. It wasn't one rogue crew chief anymore, it was a grassroots modification spreading through the fighter groups like wildfire. The mechanics were talking to each other, sharing techniques, ignoring regulations because they'd seen the results. And the pilots weren't stopping them because for the first time in months, they had a fighting chance of bringing the bombers home. You have to understand the culture that existed in those maintenance crews. These weren't men who blindly followed regulations. They were men who'd been keeping aircraft flying under impossible conditions for years. They'd learned to improvise, to adapt, to find solutions that the engineers back home never imagined. When they heard that Eddie Nowak had found a way to extend the range of the P-51, they didn't wait for official approval. They grabbed their tools and got to work. By February 23, the modification had spread to 8 fighter groups. By February 24, it was 12. The mechanics called it Nowak's Boost, or simply the modification, and they traded techniques in the maintenance hangars like bootleggers trading recipes during Prohibition. The official channels didn't even know it was happening until the mission reports started coming in, all showing the same impossible fuel efficiency, the same extended range, the same bombers returning intact because the escorts hadn't abandoned them. Captain James Donovan flew his third mission with the modified engine on February 25, a strike against aircraft factories in Regensburg, 580 miles from base. The route took them over Bavaria, deep into southern Germany, territory the P-51s had never reached before. And when the Luftwaffe rose to meet them, scrambling from airfields that had always been beyond American fighter range, they found P-51 Mustangs waiting at altitude. The German pilots had grown accustomed to fighting bombers that were alone and vulnerable. They'd developed tactics specifically for attacking unescorted formations approach from head-on to minimize exposure to defensive guns, concentrate fire on the lead aircraft, break up the formation and pick off stragglers. But those tactics assumed the absence of escort fighters. With Mustangs flying top cover, everything changed. Donovan's gun camera footage from that mission shows a Bf-109 diving through a bomber formation, trying to make a head-on pass at a B-17. The German pilot never saw Donovan coming. One burst from the P-51's 6.50 caliber machine guns and the 109 disintegrated, pieces of wing and fuselage tumbling through the slipstream. The bomber it had been targeting flew on undamaged. That mission returned with only 2 bombers lost not to fighters, but to flak over the target. The other 298 aircraft made it home. 8th Air Force had never seen results like that from a deep penetration raid. Something had changed, and the brass couldn't ignore it anymore. On February 26, representatives from Packard Motors and North American Aviation arrived at RAF Debden to examine the modified engines. They were not happy. The lead engineer, a man named Robert Morrison, had flown in from Detroit specifically to put an end to what he called dangerous field modifications that void every warranty and violate every specification we've established. Eddie Nowak met him in the maintenance hangar, surrounded by the engines he'd modified. Morrison walked around one of the disassembled Merlins, examining the pistons, checking the cylinder heads, measuring tolerances with calipers and micrometers. He was looking for evidence of damage, proof that the higher boost pressure was destroying the engines. He found nothing. "This doesn't make sense," Morrison muttered, more to himself than to Nowak. "At this boost pressure, you should be seeing detonation. Pre-ignition at minimum. These pistons should be hammered." "But they're not," Nowak said quietly. "No, they're not." Morrison stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "You're running 7 inches over maximum boost. That's a 20% increase in manifold pressure. The fuel consumption should be through the roof." "It's not. We're getting better fuel economy." "That's impossible. Higher boost means more fuel." "Not if you lean out the mixture. The Brits figured that out 2 years ago with the Spitfire Mark 9. Same engine, same principles. We're just applying it to the P-51. Morrison looked at Nowak like he was seeing him for the first time. "You're a crew chief, not an engineer. How do you know about Merlin specifications for the Spitfire Mark 9? "I read the manuals. All of them. British, American, captured German technical documents on the DB605 engine. I read everything I can get my hands on because I need to understand what makes these engines work." Nowak gestured at the Merlin on the stand. "The factory specs are conservative because they have to be. You build in safety margins for pilots who don't know how to manage their engines, for mechanics who don't maintain them properly, for combat damage and fuel contamination and 1,000 other variables. But in the hands of a good pilot with a well-maintained engine, this thing can do more than you think." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the engine, studying Nowak, studying the evidence of his own eyes that contradicted everything his engineering training told him should be true. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I need to make some phone calls. And I need to run some tests. But Sergeant, if this holds up, if we can prove this is safe and reliable." He trailed off, shaking his head. Do you have any idea what you've done? We've been trying to extend the range of the P-51 for 6 months. We've designed new fuel tanks, we've tested different propellers, we've analyzed every aspect of the airframe. And you solved it by turning a knob. It's not just turning a knob, sir. It's understanding what the engine can do versus what the manual says it should do. There's a difference. Over the next week, Morrison and his team ran exhaustive tests on the modified engines. They put them on test stands and ran them at maximum boost for hours. They examined them with X-rays and ultrasound. They pushed them harder than any pilot would ever push them in combat. And the engines kept running, kept performing, kept proving that Eddie Nowak's unauthorized modification was not just safe, but revolutionary. The official report from Packard Motors arrived at 8th Air Force Headquarters on March 4, 1944. It confirmed what the mission results had already proven: the modification worked. With proper implementation, it could extend the range of the P-51B by approximately 80 to 90 miles with no significant increase in engine failure rates. The report recommended immediate adoption across all P-51 units, with formal technical orders to be issued specifying the exact procedures. But by the time that report arrived, the modification was already standard practice in 15 fighter groups. The mechanics hadn't waited for official approval. They'd seen the results, they'd talked to their counterparts in other units, and they'd made the decision themselves. This was bigger than regulations, bigger than protocols, bigger than the chain of command. This was about bringing their pilots home alive and giving the bombers a fighting chance. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, was briefed on the situation on March 6 during his visit to England. He listened to the reports, examined the data, and asked the question that was on everyone's mind: why didn't our engineers think of this? Nobody had a good answer. The truth was that the engineers had been looking for complex solutions to what turned out to be a simple problem. They'd been constrained by factory specifications and safety regulations and the assumption that those specifications existed for good reasons. It took a crew chief in a combat zone, watching his pilots run out of fuel mission after mission, to question those assumptions. Arnold made his decision quickly. Make it official. Issue the technical orders, update the manuals, and spread this modification to every P-51 unit in the theater. And find this Sergeant Nowak. I want to pin a medal on him personally. But Eddie Nowak wasn't interested in medals. He was in the maintenance hangar at RAF Debden, training other crew chiefs on the proper technique for the modification. He'd become something of a celebrity among the mechanics, the man who'd beaten the engineers at their own game. But he deflected the praise, insisted it was just common sense, claimed anyone would have figured it out eventually. What he didn't say, what he couldn't quite articulate, was the weight he'd been carrying since that first morning when Captain Donovan had taken off with an illegally modified engine. The knowledge that if something had gone wrong, if the engine had failed, it would have been his fault. His decision. His responsibility. The fact that it had worked out didn't erase that weight, it just gave it a different meaning. On March 8, 1944, the formal technical order was issued: field modification of Packard V1650 Merlin engines for extended range operations. It specified the exact boost pressure settings, fuel mixture ratios, and operational procedures that Eddie Nowak had figured out in a single night of unauthorized experimentation. Within 2 weeks, over 400 P-51s across England had been modified according to the new specifications. And on March 6, 2 days before the official order was issued, the 8th Air Force launched its first bombing raid on Berlin. The formation consisted of 672 bombers escorted by 801 fighters, the largest force ever assembled for a single mission. The route stretched 600 miles from England to the German capital and back. Every P-51 in the formation was running Nowak's modification. Every pilot knew they were attempting something that a month ago would have been impossible. Captain James Donovan led his squadron into German airspace at 9:15 hours, the winter sun glinting off the canopies of 300 fighters surrounding the bomber stream. Below them, the snow-covered landscape of Germany rolled past forests, towns, rivers, the whole geography of the Reich spread out like a map. And ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, was Berlin. The Luftwaffe met them 50 miles from the city, throwing everything they had into the sky: Bf-109s, FW-190s, Me-110s, even a few Mi-62 jets that the Germans were just beginning to deploy. It was the largest air battle of the war up to that point, hundreds of aircraft twisting and turning in three-dimensional space, contrails sketching patterns against the grey winter sky, tracer rounds creating deadly geometry, aircraft falling like burning leaves. But the P-51s were there. Not turning back, not running low on fuel, not abandoning the bombers to fend for themselves. They were there over Berlin, mixing it up with the Luftwaffe, protecting the bombers all the way to the target and all the way home. Donovan's gun camera recorded him shooting down two Bf-109s and damaging a third. His fuel gauge, as he crossed back over the English Channel 4 hours after takeoff, showed 45 minutes of fuel remaining. 45 minutes. A month ago, he would have run dry over France. The mission returned with 6 to 9 bombers lost a grievous toll, but far less than the catastrophic losses of the previous months. The escorts had made the difference. And the escorts had been possible because a crew chief named Eddie Nowak had decided that the manual was wrong. When Donovan landed at Debden and climbed out of Charlotte's Web, he found his crew chief waiting with the same anxious expression he'd worn for every mission since the modification began. But this time, Donovan didn't just shake his hand. He hugged him. "Eddie, we hit Berlin. We escorted bombers to Berlin and brought them back. Do you understand what that means?" Nowak understood. It meant the air war had turned. It meant the Luftwaffe could no longer hide behind range limitations. It meant American bombers could strike anywhere in Germany with fighter protection. It meant they had a chance to win. That night, in maintenance hangars across England, crew chiefs raised unauthorized toasts to one of their own. The man who'd broken the rules to save lives. The man who'd proven that sometimes, the best solution comes from the people closest to the problem. The man who'd changed the war with a wrench and a theory. But there was still work to do. Berlin was just the beginning. April 8, 1944. 27,000 feet above Brunswick, Germany. 3 months. That's how long it had been since Eddie Nowak had made his unauthorized modification to Captain Donovan's P-51. 3 months since that first terrifying mission to Gotha when he'd waited on the tarmac, wondering if his calculations were correct or if he'd just killed his pilot. 3 months since everything changed. Now, Donovan's P-51, still bearing the name Charlotte's Web, on its cowling led a formation of 48 Mustangs deep into Germany for the second time that day. This was their new reality. 2 missions in 1 day, escorts to targets that had been untouchable just months before, fuel reserves that would have seemed like fantasy in January. Below the fighters, 312 B-17s maintained their steady course toward another synthetic oil plant. But something was different today. The Luftwaffe wasn't rising to meet them. The German fighters that had been so aggressive in February and March were nowhere to be seen. Donovan scanned the sky through his canopy, searching for the telltale glint of sunlight on metal, the contrails of climbing interceptors, any sign of the enemy. He found nothing but empty sky. "Red Leader, this is Big Friend Lead." The bomber commander's voice crackled through Donovan's headset. "You seeing what we're not seeing?" "Affirmative. Big Friend. Sky's clear. They're not coming up." And that was the real story of April 1944, not the missions themselves, but the missions that didn't happen. The Luftwaffe was conserving its fighters, pulling back from daytime operations, ceding control of German airspace because they could no longer afford the attrition. Every time they rose to challenge the bombers, they had to fight through the escorts first. And fighting through P-51s that could stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin was a losing proposition. The mathematics that had once favored the Germans had reversed. Now it was the Luftwaffe losing 3 fighters for every bomber they shot down. Now it was German pilot training programs that couldn't replace losses fast enough. Now it was German families receiving the telegrams, reading the letters that began, "We regret to inform you." You need to understand what this meant strategically. The entire German war economy ran on oil, synthetic oil produced by plants scattered across the Reich. Destroy those plants, and you destroy the fuel that powered the Panzers, the Stukas, the V-2 rockets, the entire mechanized Wehrmacht. Before Nowak's modification, those plants had been effectively invulnerable. The bombers could reach them, but without escort, the losses were too severe to sustain. After the modification, those plants became targets on a list, checked off one by one as the 8th Air Force systematically dismantled Germany's ability to wage war. The oil plant at Brunswick burned for 3 days after that April raid. The one at Pollitz burned for a week. The one at Merseburg, the largest synthetic oil facility in Germany, was hit 6 times between May and September, reducing its output to 17% of capacity. By August, German tank divisions were being issued horse-drawn wagons because they couldn't get enough fuel for their vehicles. By September, Luftwaffe fighter pilots were limiting training flights to conserve aviation gasoline. By October, the war was effectively over. Germany just didn't know it yet. And it all traced back to a crew chief who decided that the manual was wrong. The recognition, when it came, was oddly anticlimactic. General Arnold did pin a medal on Eddie Nowak, the Legion of Merit, presented in a ceremony at RAF Debden on April 15, 1944. Nowak stood at attention in his dress uniform, uncomfortable with the attention, while Arnold praised his initiative, technical expertise, and unwavering dedication to the success of the air campaign. But the real recognition came from the pilots. Every fighter jock in 8th Air Force knew Nowak's name. They knew what he'd done, knew that his modification was the reason they could bring their bombers home, knew that dozens, maybe hundreds of them were alive because a crew chief had questioned authority and been proven right. Captain James Donovan, promoted to major in March and given command of his own squadron, made a point of visiting the maintenance hangar before every mission. Not to check on his aircraft, he trusted his crew chief completely, but to talk to Nowak, to maintain the connection between pilot and mechanic that had sparked everything. On the morning of May 12, Donovan found Nowak in his usual spot, bent over a Merlin engine with a wrench in one hand and a cigarette behind his ear. "Morning, Eddie. How's she looking?" "Clean as a whistle, Major. You'll get to Berlin and back with fuel to spare." "Berlin again? That's our 23rd escort to the big city. You remember when we thought we'd never make it once?" Nowak straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag stained with oil and hydraulic fluid. "I remember a lot of things. I remember watching bombers take off and counting how many didn't come back. I remember pilots running out of fuel over France. I remember thinking there had to be a better way. You found it. You changed the whole damn war, Eddie. I just turned a knob and leaned out a mixture. Any mechanic could have done it. But they didn't. You did." Donovan paused, choosing his words carefully. "I got a letter yesterday from a B-17 pilot guy I don't even know, flies with the 91st Bomb Group. He said his crew would be dead right now if we hadn't been there to protect them over Leipzig last month. He wanted to thank the pilot who saved them. I told him he was thanking the wrong guy." Nowak looked uncomfortable. "Major, you know how many letters I've gotten like that? 43. 43 bomber crewmen writing to thank their escort pilots. Every single one of them owes you their life, Eddie. You and every crew chief who had the guts to make your modification even though it violated regulations. We did what needed doing. That's all." And that, in the end, was the essence of Eddie Nowak. He'd seen a problem, figured out a solution, and implemented it despite every regulation saying he shouldn't. He'd risked his career, risked court-martial, risked everything because bomber crews were dying and he knew he could help. That kind of moral courage, the courage to do what's right even when what's right is also illegal, was rare enough in civilian life. In the military, with its emphasis on following orders and maintaining chain of command, it was almost unheard of. But it was also exactly what the situation required. If Nowak had gone through official channels, the modification would have been tied up in committees and reviews for months. Engineering would have demanded extensive testing. Procurement would have worried about warranty implications. Legal would have drafted indemnification clauses. And while all that bureaucracy ground forward, bomber crews would have kept dying over Germany. Instead, Nowak made the modification in secret, proved it worked in combat, and forced the system to adapt to reality rather than waiting for reality to conform to the system. It was insubordination. It was brilliant. And it worked. By summer of 1944, the tactical situation over Europe had completely transformed. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was reduced to scattered resistance. German fighter production was actually increasing. The factories were turning out Bf-109s and Fw-190s faster than ever, but they had no pilots to fly them and no fuel to power them. The synthetic oil plants that 8th Air Force had systematically destroyed couldn't be rebuilt fast enough. The experienced aces who might have trained new pilots were dead, shot down by American fighters that could now escort bombers anywhere in the Reich. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Luftwaffe was conspicuously absent. They couldn't contest the landings because they'd been bled white over Germany in the preceding months. The air superiority that made D-Day possible had been won bomber by bomber, fighter by fighter, in the skies over Frankfurt and Berlin and Munich and Hamburg. And that air superiority had only become possible because P-51s could finally escort the bombers all the way to their targets. Major James Donovan flew his 50th combat mission on July 4, 1944 Independence Day, which seemed appropriate. The target was another oil plant, this one deep in Poland. The round trip was over 1,200 miles, impossible territory for any escort fighter in the world except the modified P-51s of the 8th Air Force. They escorted 247 bombers to the target, fought off a desperate Luftwaffe attack by a scratch force of 20 German fighters, and brought every bomber home intact. When Donovan landed at Debden that evening and climbed out of his aircraft, Eddie Nowak was there with his checklist and his wrench, same as always. But this time, Donovan noticed something he'd been too busy to see before. Nowak looked older. The baby-faced 26-year-old who'd made that unauthorized modification in February had aged years in 5 months. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, grey streaks in his hair, a weariness in his posture that spoke of too many missions, too many pilots depending on his work, too much responsibility for too long. You should take some leave, Eddie. Go to London, get drunk, see a show. You've earned it. Nowak shook his head. Can't. We've got 3 birds down for engine changes and another 5 needing major service. Besides, who'd watch your airplane while I'm gone? Eddie dash. I'm fine, Major. Just tired. We're all tired. He forced a smile. But we're winning. That's what matters, right? We're actually winning this thing. They were winning. By August, the German army was in full retreat across France. By September, Allied forces were crossing into Germany itself. By October, the strategic bombing campaign had achieved its objective. German industrial production was collapsing. Their transportation network was in ruins. Their ability to sustain military operations was effectively destroyed. And through it all, the P-51s kept flying with their modified engines, kept escorting bombers, kept proving that Eddie Nowak's unauthorized modification was one of the single most important tactical innovations of the entire war. The official history books would later credit various generals and air marshals with winning the air war over Europe. They would talk about strategic doctrine, resource allocation, tactical innovations. They would mention the P-51 Mustang as a technological marvel, a war-winning weapon system. But they would rarely mention the crew chief who figured out how to make that weapon system actually work at its full potential. That's the way military history works. The generals get the credit. The engineers get the patents. The crew chiefs get a line in a maintenance log. But the pilots knew. Every fighter pilot in 8th Air Force knew that they owed their lives to a mechanic who'd broken the rules. And they never forgot. On November 10, 1944, Major James Donovan completed his tour of duty 75 combat missions, 14 confirmed kills, a distinguished flying cross, and more awards than he could fit on his dress uniform. He was scheduled to return to the States for a well-earned rest and a posting as an instructor. Before he left, he made one final visit to the maintenance hangar. Eddie Nowak was exactly where Donovan expected to find him, elbow deep in a Merlin engine, making adjustments, checking tolerances, ensuring that the next pilot who flew this aircraft would have every possible advantage. Came to say goodbye, Eddie. Nowak looked up, surprise flickering across his face. You're heading out. Already. Tour's done. Time to go home. Home. Nowak said the word like he was tasting it, trying to remember what it meant. Must be nice. Come with me. Put in for a transfer. You've done enough. More than enough. But Nowak shook his head. Can't. These birds still need maintaining. The pilots still need someone who knows these engines inside and out. And he paused, searching for words. This is where I belong. This is where I can do the most good. Donovan understood. Some men go to war and can't wait to leave. Others go to war and can't figure out how to return to peace. Eddie Nowak was somewhere in between, a man who'd found his purpose in the most unlikely circumstances, who discovered that his knowledge and skill could save lives, and who couldn't walk away from that responsibility even when he'd earned the right to do so. Take care of yourself, Eddie. And take care of these pilots. They need you. I will. And Major, you take care too. You've got people waiting for you back home. They shook hands, pilot and mechanic, officer and enlisted man, two people who'd been brought together by circumstance and bound together by mutual respect. Then Donovan walked out of the hangar into the November rain, heading for a transport that would take him back to America, back to a world where people didn't die every day, where the sky wasn't full of contrails and combat, where mechanics followed the manual and pilots came home safe every night. Eddie Nowak stayed in England until May 1945, when the war in Europe finally ended. He maintained P-51s through the final months of the conflict, trained other mechanics in the modification that bore his name, and watched as the air war he'd helped win ground down to its inevitable conclusion. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, he was 3,700 miles from home, covered in engine oil, holding a wrench, exactly where he'd been for 3 years. He received his discharge in June and returned to Detroit, where Packard Motors offered him a job as a consulting engineer. He declined. He took a position instead at a small aircraft maintenance facility at a municipal airport, working on civilian aircraft, teaching young mechanics the trade, living quietly and without fanfare. He never talked much about the war. When people asked what he'd done, he'd say he was a mechanic, nothing special. The Legion of Merit stayed in a drawer, along with the letters from pilots thanking him for keeping their aircraft flying, for making the modification that saved their lives, for being the kind of mechanic every pilot hopes to have and few actually get. James Donovan went on to a distinguished career in the Air Force, retiring as a colonel in 1965. He stayed in touch with Eddie Nowak, Christmas cards at first, then occasional phone calls, then annual visits when Donovan's lecture circuit brought him near Detroit. They'd have dinner, talk about old times, remember the men they'd served with, the missions they'd flown, the war they'd won together. And every time, Donovan would ask the same question: do you ever regret it? Breaking the rules, risking everything. And every time, Nowak would give the same answer: not for a second. Because in the end, that's what mattered. Not the regulations he'd violated, not the risk he'd taken, not even the recognition he'd received. What mattered was that when he saw a problem that was getting men killed, he'd fixed it. He'd done what needed doing, regardless of what the manual said, regardless of the personal cost, regardless of everything except the knowledge that his pilots needed him and he had a solution. That's the real story of how one mechanic's illegal engine modification made P-51 Mustangs reach Berlin and back. It's not a story about engines or boost pressure or fuel consumption rates. It's a story about moral courage, the courage to question authority when authority is wrong, the courage to act when action carries enormous risk, the courage to trust your own judgment even when everyone else says you're crazy. Eddie Nowak had that courage. And because he did, hundreds of bomber crews survived missions they shouldn't have survived. Because he did, the 8th Air Force was able to strike targets deep in Germany that shaped the outcome of the war. Because he did, the air war over Europe turned from a costly stalemate into an Allied victory. The modification that began as an unauthorized experiment in a maintenance hangar at RAF Debden became standard procedure for every P-51 unit in the European theater. It was eventually incorporated into the factory specifications for later P-51 models. It influenced post-war engine development and aircraft design. And it proved that sometimes, the best innovations come not from the drawing boards of engineers, but from the practical experience of the people closest to the problem. On February 20, 1944, Captain James Donovan turned back from a bombing mission because his fuel gauge said he had to. On February 21, 1944, he flew all the way to the target and back because a mechanic named Eddie Nowak decided the fuel gauge was lying. That decision changed everything.